Welcome everyone to this month's OpenNTF webinar on developing applications with XPages Jakarta EE. I am Jesse Gallagher. I will be your presenter. Graham Akers is also with us. He'll likely be handling the Q&A or if anything goes catastrophically wrong with my connection. This one is in the grand tradition of August webinars where all the Europeans are inner tubing around the Mediterranean or whatever it is they do during August. So it's going to be a nice, cozy, quiet one in the vein of late night college radio. So I'll get into our standard preliminaries here. So the agenda is pretty straightforward. It's going to be a welcome, which is this, and then I will be doing the presentation. And then at the end, we will do a Q&A. I mean, technically, I have the Q&A open, so if anything is really that would be served well to do immediately, I may answer that, but in general, we wait till the end to do the Q&A as they come up. And now, as always, we should and will thank our sponsors. Our main ones are HCL, made a contribution to help our organization. That's the main thing that lets us do these webinars. I mean, they are, they're less expensive than an in-person conference, but they are not free, and they allow this. Contests like hackathons, something that we do from time to time. We'll likely be doing more of that sort of thing in the future, and just generally running the organization. Like we do keep costs low, but there are costs. And similarly, one of the things that helps us keep our costs low is that Prominic donates all of our IT related services. They do our hosting, they do our infrastructure management, they do our sysadmin for day-to-day operation. And that is a delight because they know it better than a bunch of other developers on the team do. So it is great, and we can't thank either of these enough. It's what allows this to happen. And our customary slide here about how this is our community. So, I think I said something similar to this last month when I was doing this, and I always, one of my goals is to avoid the notion that OpenNTF is the board and then everybody else is just somebody attending OpenNTF stuff. Like, no, this is all of us. We are all volunteers. Everybody who is attending one of these, who is in Discord, who is using OpenNTF stuff, who is contributing, we are all members of OpenNTF. I mean, with contributors signing something, but nonetheless, we are in the community. And no effort is too small if you want to become a volunteer. You can ask around in our Discord about if you have a great idea and you want other people to help. We can absolutely, it's likely other people will like to as well. You can just take an existing project and use it and report things. The project that I'm going to talk about today, the Jakarta EE project, has benefited tremendously from this in ways that are ongoing, especially when it comes to the JSF stuff. You can write guides and documentation. That's one of the best things you can do is take someone else's project, use it, and then write a blog post or a guide or contribute documentation to it. I don't think there's ever been a project, especially an open source one, that can't benefit from a little more documentation. And then in general, you can add reviews on projects and stars and snippets and that sort of thing. You can just generally share it and appreciate the work if you like it. Now, we do have a couple upcoming events. We have our Asia Pacific Repair Cafe, which, depending on your time zone, may be today or I guess tomorrow. It's in 11 hours is the easy way to say it. So if you are in any of these time zones or if you know somebody, let them know. We definitely want to do more. I mean, we are, there's no secret that most of us are Americans and Europeans, and so we're going to be slanted very much towards, UTC and the US Eastern as our time zones, but we want to do more with Asia Pacific, and if we can get more people to attend these, that would be delightful. So if you know anyone, let them know. And then next week is CollabSphere, which is the current name of what used to be NWLUG. I mean, it's been a couple of years now, but still, I like the old name too. This will be in person in Chicago. So this is happening next week. There are a couple things related to OpenNTF. The main one is our roundtable. I believe it's on Wednesday. I'll be doing a couple presentations, including a workshop on Tuesday. And so take a look at the schedule. There's a lot of interesting stuff as always. I imagine you could probably fill in every time slot with at least one thing you want to attend. So if you're able to attend, you should. I did see that Richard mentioned that some of these will be streaming now. So I have not looked into the specifics because I will be there. But if you're not able to attend physically, you should look to see what can be done, what's available, and take a look at those. I think it's ones in a certain room are going to be available for streaming, which is a nice bonus if you're not able to make it out to Chicago. And OpenNTF's next webinar in September will be on debugging in general, with Kim Green and Paul Albright. So we can look forward to that. We'll have a larger description as time allows, but that's the one we'll be slated for in about a month. And now, before I get to the presentation, I want to mention how to ask questions. So the first question is, everyone asked, will this be recorded? Yes, it's being recorded right now, and then it will be up on YouTube. If you have other questions about the project, you can put them in the questions pane and go to webinar. They show up in a nice orderly fashion, and then at the end of the presentation, most likely we will respond to them verbally and not necessarily in the questions pane. And please keep questions related to the topics that our speakers are discussing. So, if you're saying what is going to be in Domino 15, I cannot answer. If you're saying why is XPages like it is, I cannot answer. I can answer questions about this project though. If you have unrelated questions, you can post them in our Discord. There are a lot of channels there, a lot of topics. And so you can go to openntf.org/discord. That will give you a rundown on what it is and provide you a link to join. Now on to the presentation with me. So kick off here as an introduction. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Jesse Gallagher. I'm CTO of a consulting company called I Know Some Guys in Pennsylvania in the United States. I'm also the IP manager and longtime board member at OpenNTF. I blog primarily about Java and Domino stuff at frostilic.us, and I'm available on ActivityPub or Mastodon at jesse@pub.frostilic.us. So if you want to follow me there, that's where I do my social media these days for various reasons. Now the agenda of this. If you attended my presentation I did a year ago about today, some of this stuff is going to be similar. I want to go over, just in case you weren't here, a gist of like what are Jakarta EE and MicroProfile, the two specs, like what the heck does that even mean? What is this project? And then I'm going to talk about the main structure of this is going to be about the different, like 4 different ways you might develop an application. But before I get to that, I'm going to do a little bit about the shared components that will be in all of them. So after the introduction stuff, that's where it's going to diverge from last year and talk about a little bit more of the specifics of how you would actually do this stuff and what that looks like. So talk about some prerequisites with this, like using this project and getting the most out of it. You'll have to come in with either a comfort or willingness to learn Java. So all of this stuff is very Java heavy. If you've only ever done XPages with server-side JavaScript, I mean, you may have dipped into Java or something. Little of this will apply to server-side JavaScript. So that is, that's the prerequisite. Ideally, you'd also be familiar with annotations and Java 8 constructs like optional and streams. Not strictly required because you would kind of learn as you go. But the more you know about something past Java 6 or annotations which existed in Java 6 or were not as heavily used, the better. And you'll need the ability to install plugins in Designer and Domino. You do not need, however, a knowledge of OSGI. You don't need to know anything about Maven or Tycho or using Eclipse or IntelliJ or Visual Studio Code. Those things help, but they are not needed. And for any of this stuff, you do not need to start an app from scratch. All of the things I'll be talking about are in the context of new from scratch applications, but you could add this project onto an app that's existed for 30 years and get benefits from it. So none of this stuff requires starting over. I think you might want to, but as we all know, if you have a large project, it's rarely the right idea to throw it all away and start over. You want to build from what you have. And you can do that with this, even though I'm not showing examples of that as such. Now, talking about Jakarta EE and MicroProfile. So Jakarta EE, and I'll kind of go through these slides a little quickly since I did do these last year as well. This is the current form of Java EE. It was originally from Sun and then Oracle, and then now it's at the Eclipse Foundation. It's fully open source. The specifications are open source. Their main implementations are open source. There's nothing that is, you can pay for support for it, but you don't have to. It's 100% open source. It's all Eclipse licensed, and that's delightful. Releases 8 and 9 focused on moving from Java EE to Jakarta EE. So 8 was basically the same exact thing, but just under a new name. And then 9 moved the classes from Java X whatever, like Java X.servlet to Jakarta.servlet, etc. Jakarta EE 10 made new changes. There are new features. There are things that were removed, like old cruft. but it did also move to a newer Java version than we have in Domino 12. And so we can't use that yet. However, we will, as part of the Domino 14 beta, I have a branch of this project that is moving to some of these newer versions, and that is nice. There will be another wall in the future, but for now, we will get that stuff. But right now, we're kind of focused on, this project is focused on Jakarta EE 9. That said, Jakarta EE 9 is still much newer than XPages, so we get a lot of benefits. MicroProfile started during the worst of Java EE stagnation, so much like various products we're familiar with, Java EE kind of stalled because Oracle, the vendor, was not really interested in it. So the Eclipse Foundation started up, a couple vendors started this project called MicroProfile. Ostensibly, it's targeted towards microservices architectures, which is not Domino. Like Domino is a lot of things, it's not microservices, but it really actually ends up being kind of like an incubator for new capabilities. Like there are certain things like the configuration spec is moving to Jakarta, for example, I believe. And they're just nice features that layer on top. And then now onto the standards in this project. So normally if you look up something like say, hey, what about Jakarta EE and MicroProfile, you just search for it on Google or Stack Overflow, you're going to see stuff about WAR files and EAR files and Maven packaging and Gradle and all that. Those are not needed here. Domino is our server. We're not using Glassfish or Liberty or any of the others. NSFs are our packages. This project implements a large subset of both, but not all of either. So there are some that like authentication that are inapplicable on Domino because the server handles authentication for us. Some like EJB, Enterprise Java Beans, are on the way out. So I'm not going to bother with those unless there's some specific reason. And some like WebSockets face technical limitations because, you know, if the server doesn't support WebSockets, the spec can't either. And then there are some that I just haven't gotten around to yet, like batch and things like that. And finally, on this topic, with the move from Java EE to Jakarta EE, many specs changed their name. So what used to be called JSP is now Jakarta Pages. What used to be called JSF is Jakarta Faces. You'll notice a trend. JAX-RS is Jakarta REST. JPA is Jakarta Persistence. I'll likely, and I know I did in this slide deck, use the names interchangeably out of habit. And actually, that is beneficial in the short term. If you want to look up for how to use Jakarta Pages, you will probably have an easier time searching for JSP for now. That will change over time as more people talk about it. The advantage of finding something that uses the newer name means that it's probably going to be newer and cleaner and more compatible with a lot of the other newer stuff. But if you search for Jakarta Pages, it will probably be harder to find the answers you want. So it's useful to know both names. And I will still, much like I call the Domino REST API keep out of habit, I call JSP or Jakarta Pages JSP out of habit, and will do so for a long time. Now onto the project itself. So this started as adding a few specs. It's grown to encompass quite a bit, such as JSON capabilities, pages, and Jakarta No SQL. It's expanded to include MicroProfile as well. And the main thing that's important here is that it primarily focuses on in-NSF development in Designer. So you can use this stuff with OSGI-based apps. I do. But you kind of have to know what you're doing there. But the idea is that these are things where you fire, after installing it, you fire up Designer and you do all of your stuff there. So you have your XPages there. You also have your XPages Jakarta EE stuff there. So you do not need to do any OSGI stuff on your own. The idea is that this is enhancing the existing toolkit and making it much, much more capable, but without making you completely change your development workflow. You use Designer, and that's the main thing, for better and worse. For usage, you install it and then you enable the libraries. There's a ton. I'm probably going to consolidate this, but they show up as XPages Libraries. So all of these specs show up there the same way that the extension library does, the relational one, or if you use OpenNTF Domino API, you just enable them there. So it's done the same way as all these other things like for XPages. Oh, it's my terrible cat. And I will talk a little bit about examples of how to do this. I've been gradually accumulating examples in the project repository. There's an examples directory in the repository and in the distribution that contains on-disk projects. So that has some for JSF. It has a CRUD in REST sort of thing. In this presentation, or for this and for the workshop on Tuesday, I created a series of to-do apps. I'll be talking about that later, but those are some new examples I uploaded yesterday, I believe. And so there's a growing number of examples. It's not it doesn't cover all of your needs yet, but as we go and as I come up with more ideas, I'm trying to add more. So like I said, I'm going to talk about modes of development, and I can kind of stop rushing now that I'm into the main meat of the presentation. I'm going to talk about modes of development, 4 ways to do an application, but before that, I'm going to start talking about shared components. So these are things that you'll likely use in any application where you're using Jakarta EE. You may not necessarily use all of them, particularly the data access layer, but these are things that no matter what you do, you can and likely should, but not necessarily will, use in no matter how you're doing it. So no matter if you're doing XPages, if you're doing REST services, if you're doing Jakarta Faces or MVC, you'll use a lot of these things in common. And the big one is going to be CDI. So that is kind of the backbone of modern Jakarta EE in general. I'll get into a little bit of CDI. It's a bizarre name. Whenever you hear CDI, think managed beans, but better. It kind of came from the JSF managed beans concept that was in that XPages forked. XPages has kind of the very first version of that. CDI is a much newer one. It covers a lot more ground, but think of it as managed beans, but better. That's the safest way. We'll talk about expression language, which is a newer version of the same one. This does have a direct lineage from the one that's in XPages. So it went through a period where it was called unified expression language and then just back to expression language. This has a newer version than what's in XPages. So one of the features is that you just bump that up to a better spec. REST. So even in XPages or JSF apps, REST services come in handy. I mean, if you've been doing a lot of XPages development, you've probably used the JSON RPC or REST service controls from the extension library. Even if you're doing primarily like server-side rendered stuff, you'll every once in a while want a REST service if you're using like a fancy data table or something like that. And along those lines, probably joining in it with it will be JSON P and JSON B, which are the very functional names for the JSON capabilities that come with Jakarta EE. You can think of things like JSON and Jackson. So those two cover varyingly things where you just have like JSON object and you create maps and things like that. And also where you will have an object, a Java object, and convert that to and from JSON. So JSON P is the one that just deals with the notion of writing and processing JSON, that's the P, and JSON B is binding. So JSON B is where you take an object that's not, it's just a normal Java object and you convert it to and from JSON. And then we'll talk about, and then there's some MicroProfile components. The REST client is a big one, which is actually not in this presentation because that's kind of like you have to have a reason to use it. But for example, that's one where it comes up where you often want to access a remote REST service. And the MicroProfile REST client is extremely good at that. It does it in a very clean way that's way better than what you'll have in base Java or in Lotus Script or anything like that. So to talk a little bit about expression language, this is our old friend. This spec we're out of what started in JSF. Existing EL expressions still work in XPages, including SSJS. So you enable this and then everything should work the same, except this is a little stricter about nulls, which is actually useful. The XPages one, say if you misspell the name of the bean you're trying to access, it will just kind of end up blank. Here it will actually say, hey, you can't call something on this null object. That can be annoying sometimes, but it's actually for the best. The idea is that there's no configuration necessary. You enable it and it will take over in XPages. And this spec will also show up in JSP, JSF, and other places, like some more esoteric CDI, and there are other specs that use it as well. So it's become one of the main components within the JEE stack. So what you get, some of the same stuff as before. So you have the same syntax. If you've used it, foo.bar, or like doc.firstname, etc. Those all work. You also get function calls, which that's always been one of the big ticket items that somebody will put on Stack Overflow saying, hey, I'm using expression language in XPages. How do I call a function? And the answer is you don't. Now you can. And so that's one of the nice things. There is a special prefix if you're trying to do runtime bindings to do some syntax that's not legal in the old one. It's just kind of a way to get around designer yelling at you and preventing you from saving the page. You also get string concatenation, which was oddly missing in earlier expression language. Here's some basic examples. So, you have the same kind of manage bean guy, you have your function, and you have, for example, you can say you have a data table and you call a function on a bean that will give you a list of things. So these are just kind of more flexible things that you would either have to kind of really weird your way around in expression language, or you would just switch to server JavaScript. Now you can do it in EL. And I have some links for the spec itself and a page from Beyond, the ever delightful Beyond, talking about expression language. Now, CDI, this is, as I said, it's manage beans. Technically, the name is components and dependency injection. You don't have to care why it's called that. You also don't have to care about EJB, which is related. If you don't know what EJB is, you are fine and you don't need to know. This uses annotations instead of the XML configuration from faces config. There is technically some XML you can use, but in general, it's not needed. Cooperates with EL and general XPages variable resolution, so you can and you should replace your beans in faces config.xml entirely with this. I'll show some examples of beans and their annotations. So here, instead of having a faces config where you say manage bean scope is application and manage bean class is blah, 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 you just have your class and you do at application scope, that's an annotation, and then you say it's named markdown. So this will then be available in your XPages and other places as a bean named markdown, and you will be able to get to it. So this is application scope and it will handle all of that stuff for you. So in this case, you could easily write an XPages bean that would be the same idea and then define it there, but now this is available everywhere, and CDI beans get some special powers. So for example, you can inject things into it. So there's an annotation at inject, and you can say, I want to inject the session named Domino session. It's named Domino session to avoid the concept of an HTTP session, which is used elsewhere. But what this means is that when you call abbreviate name, this session will just be magically available. So the CDI runtime will do what it needs to do to get the session object in there. You do not need to do xlibutil, get current session. You don't need to get it some other way. It will just be there. And this is just kind of handled by the CDI magic. You can do this with those. You can do this with your own beans. So I have a request object here that says also I want to access the application scoped one. You have fancy annotations about post construct and predestroy. Predestroy can be potentially useful if you have a request that does like you if you access network resources or something like that, you can make sure that this is just kind of handled. Predestroy gets a little weirder when it comes to things like session and things like that, where their lifetime is a little more nebulous, but certainly for request and application, it makes a lot of sense. So if you have some kind of network resource, Predestroy can be extremely useful, and it doesn't have the same kinds of problems as finalize in Java does, if you're familiar with that. CDI Beyond beans. So managed beans are the basic case for CDI and most of what we as developers will use. It does go beyond that. It provides foundational layers for things like REST services and MVC and NoSQL. Things can get weird when you dive in. There's all sorts of like creating objects on the fly effectively, and proxies and all sorts of discovery modes and bean objects and passivization and all that. You don't really need to care until you're actually working on a framework in general. I need to care about that, but you don't, and that's part of the idea. So again, there will be some resources in the slide deck available for talking about that. And I want to talk a bit about Jakarta No SQL. So this is a data access layer similar to JPA, which is Jakarta Persistence. It is for SQL databases. So if you've ever used Hibernate, that's the same kind of idea. And then this maps between Domino data and normal Java objects reasonably efficiently. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a little overhead when you're going between a database and a Java objects, but the nice thing about this is that we all kind of have to solve this problem one way or another, and then solving it here means that I can solve it as efficiently as I can, and it does a pretty good job of it, I'd say. So there are some caveats with the spec. The version of it included in this project is specifically a beta version. Newer versions, so this is like 1.0 beta 4. Newer versions of the final spec require Java versions higher than 8, so that rules them right out for us right now. But then also the spec was kind of sliced apart, and some of it was taken to Jakarta Data, a new spec. The plan is to move to a version of these when Domino 14 is out. So the new spec works conceptually the same way, so all the stuff about repositories that I'll show will still exist in a form. The class names will change, but the ideas will be the same. but it is useful to know that there will be some code breaking changes in a future version. The way this works is that you have model objects. So if you're not familiar with the term model object, it's just kind of like the standard computer sciencey way to say a class or object that represents the noun that you're dealing with. So in these applications that I'll be showing, these are to-do entries. And so this is the to-do object that models the notion of a to-do. This is basically the Java version of the form on the back end. The driver handles mapping between NSF documents and these objects. So for example, much like with injecting an object in CDI, you do not need to have code that says get item value string title and write it into here. If you just say at column title, it will pull that in, it will write it into this object, and when you save it, it will write it to the document. It understands a lot of newer era Java classes like offset date time and things like that. It also handles enums nicely. So for example, this maps to a form that has a radio button with two options, incomplete and complete. So I made an enum called state, and it has those, and that all works nicely. There's usually a one-to-one mapping between a form and a model object. In some edge cases, for example, if you have a view and they have different types of documents, you'll probably have like an entry type that you deal with, and things get weird. But for now, we'll just assume one class is an object. It maps to a form, and that's it. Repositories are actually just interfaces. You do not provide the implementation. The NoSQL layer parses method names and arguments to translate methods into queries. So for example, you see find by status there. What that says is like, okay, so find has special meaning, which is I want to find things in the database, and then by status means, okay, well, I know there's a status field on the class, so it's going to be by whatever that item name is. That gets translated in the NoSQL layer, and then my driver says, okay, take that and turn it into DQL and QRP. It uses some views in a temporary database to try to make this efficient. So you can say this will end up being something like a DQL of status equals quote incomplete unquote, and it will handle that internally, and it works all nicely. Views and some other Domino specific behaviors like compute with form are available. I don't show them here, but there are examples in the documentation and in the repository. So for usage, you use CDI to inject a repository. CDI is how it does its magic. So I mentioned that CDI gets weird. This is one of the ways. So again, you never create a to-do repository class. You never implement this. This is done by CDI, and you don't need to know how. This can be injected into CDI beans and REST resources. So if you have something that's at application scope, or as we'll get to later, if you have a REST service, you can just inject it right there. With XPages, you'll likely use a broker bean between XPages type code and Jakarta type. I show a bit of an example with this. This can, depending on how your application is structured, this may or may not change how you want to do it. So this here is, for example, you would have a fairly thin bean that just says, okay, here's a method called getAll. The reason for this is while you can, if you have code that is instantiated by the XPages runtime, so for example, if you have a object data source, or if you have, in my old controller framework, those would not have immediate access to inject. So you might have one of these broker beans in there. They can also be resolved programmatically. I'm not going to show it because it's ugly as sin, but that is something that you can do. All right, so those are the main shared components I want to talk about. Admittedly, there are a couple others. I mentioned how like the JSON classes are useful and the REST classes are useful. But for today, because I want to get to a little bit more of like talking about these examples, which you'll be able to get from GitHub. I don't want to go into every single capability because there's a lot, but you don't need to know all of them, and that's actually a useful note. I made 4 versions of a bare bones to-do application in a whirlwind of development the last couple of days. One is in standard old XPages. One is REST with a basic HTML JavaScript UI. The UI there is kind of a stand-in for React or Angular or any number of other front-end frameworks. You probably wouldn't write it like I did, but I don't want to have to compile it with Node, so I just did it in bare HTML. Another one is MVC with Jakarta Pages, so that's JSP. And then another one is Jakarta Faces, which is JSF. These are all available on GitHub. They will be included in future distribution builds, so probably sometime after CollabSphere, I will make a 2.13 or 14, whatever I'm up to now. build, and it will start including these, but for now they are available on the repository. There's not a README in there yet, but I will add that hopefully before too long. You never know with these things, but right, I do want to have something that explains it outside the concept of this presentation. Each one of these uses Jakarta No SQL for its data access. There's a single to-do form. You saw the class to do this earlier. It uses a repository with DQL to load the document. So the examples I showed when I was talking about Jakarta No SQL, those are these. This is just basic functionality. It's a CRUD with complete and incomplete states for to-dos. Do not take these examples of fully built apps, but rather just starting points. So if we're talking about it in the sense of like the nifty 50, this would be an alpha version of one of those. So you could expand this out and have a real to-do app, but don't deploy any of these for your company to use. Though these are for apps, the mechanisms can be interwoven. So the structure of all of this is these are 4 ways to do apps, but they are all interoperable. So you can add REST services to an XPages app, or you can do, if you have a REST-based app that like other clients access, you can make an admin UI in MVC, or you can make it in XPages or JSF. You can even mix XPages and faces if you're careful. The more you do, the more caveats there are with that, but you can do it. And if you're very interested in that, you should make sure to check out the specific project channel for this in Discord. There are a couple people in there doing amazing work. Very, very interesting stuff with prime faces and things like that. So I don't want to give you the impression that if you decide that you're going to use XPages as your UI or do REST services or do MVC, that you can't either change your mind or expand it in another direction. You could do all of these in one app. These are just kind of like the common ways that you would structure something, but they are all meant to be mixed. It's a full platform, and XPages is a participant to this platform. Oh, I like that I just left it with an and there. You can imagine what sort of tantalizing things I intended to put at the end of that sentence, but did not. So that's up to you. The first route I'll talk about is what I'm calling XPages Plus. So this is XPages is still your UI toolkit of choice, as a lot of us have been doing for a long time. This retains the benefits of using existing XSP markup plus the tooling provided by designers. So if you use the WYSIWYG editor, you still get that. If you use just the controls panel or control space for autocomplete in XSP markup, when that works, you still get that. Expression language and CDI are just improvements directly in the XPages experience. So your XSP markup can improve with expression language, and you can use CDI beans. And so this is how it started. It was just make XPages better, and that is still there. And this can still mix with the other types. So if you either have an existing XPages application that you want to kind of like dip your toe into with this, where you'd say, I just want to add a bean here, some better expression language there, you can, and then add other things. Or if you want to make a completely new project and say, look, XPages is the UI toolkit I'm most comfortable with. I already have like a custom theme that I use. I have renders. I like using, one UI or whatever. One UI still works. You can do that and then just say, and then later maybe, or stick with XPages until Domino stops working. You can do that. The con is that XPages is still XPages. It remains the same. While I do add a little bit, and it's still all the downsides of working with XPages are still there and remains non-portable. So one of the kind of stealth features of this whole thing is that the more code you write that's Jakarta friendly, the more portable that code is. The XPages part is not. So the structure of one of these, and I'll just say it right now, just for the sake of keeping things sane, I'm not going to necessarily go through all the code unless I really finish things up very early. But what I will do is kind of talk about what the structure in an NSF looks like. It's going to be very similar to a normal old XPages application. So at least if you write a lot of Java. So here you'll see I have the XPages, and actually maybe I will do some of this code later. I have the XPages to-do app here. I have 3 little XPages. There are warnings because I used advanced EL, and designer says, I don't know what the heck you're talking about, but it still does work. And then I have a couple Java classes. So the to-dos being here is what I was talking about. It's kind of it's a bean that injects the Jakarta No SQL repository, and this is our broker one to kind of go between the CDI world and the controller object. So here, controller is in the vein of my framework controllers. Technically, in the example app, it's just done as an object data where I do create object and I say new controller.todos controller, but the idea is the same. This is a kind of mid-style, mid-era XPages controller object, and then it will access the to-dos bean as a managed bean in its sense of the world. You don't necessarily have to structure it like this, but this is a way that you probably would. But the nice thing about this is that this is generally going to be familiar. So I didn't expand resources here, but there are style sheets there. If you had images, they would be under image resources. And actually that will be the case for all of these. So as much as possible, I want to make it so that all of these things are approachable from somebody who has been working with Designer. Like I want to use the existing elements as much as possible. This is not supposed to be a completely tangential thing. I mean, in some of the other ways of going about stuff, you will have more or less code either in file resources or Java, but the idea is that it's still going to be the things you're given, which I think in general is nice. Like I like being able to say, hey, there's a style sheet resource in the NSF, I should use that style sheet resource. I don't need, I could put everything in web content, but I kind of like having everything organized nicely. The development experience here is pretty much the same as you're used to when it comes to the UI. The main change in this is that you can use newer syntax, EL syntax in the XSP markup. So if when you're working with the XPages editor, there's not a bunch of new there are no new components actually. This is not an XPages toolkit in that sense. But it's all the stuff you had before, and including all this custom stuff you have. So again, if you're using Poi for XPages, if you're using OpenNTF Domino API, that stuff will continue to work. If you have your own mechanisms for accessing data, that stuff will continue to work, which it also might in the other ones that we'll talk about later. The business logic will be very heavily on the Java side. If you're not already doing this, this will be a big change. So if you have heaps and heaps of server JavaScript code, that stuff just in general, I mean, you could gradually integrate it in. So for example, you could start writing beans and then access them from server JavaScript. That could work. If you are already doing Java stuff, you can expect big improvements in convenience and capability. So for example, I keep going back to the REST client or things like the JSON capabilities. So XPages ships with the IBM Commons JSON, which is functional. I'd say, like, it does produce JSON, but it's meant to just be functional. It's not meant to be friendly in the way that that JSON and Jackson and others are. So you can start. The more Java you do, the more benefit you get from this. And again, a lot of the goal is to make things you can ease into it gradually. Like if all you do is start out and say, I just want to have better expression language, that's great. If you start out and say, I just want to add one REST service, that's great. If you just want to add one, change your managed beans over to CDI and clean up your code a little bit, great. You don't have to go whole hog with any of these. That's one of the main things about this quote unquote XPages Plus. And like I said, you can still use existing XPages constructs not available elsewhere, like Domino document and Domino view. So, you don't have to throw that stuff away. I did talk about Jakarta No SQL. The example here does use Jakarta No SQL, but there's nothing about this toolkit that prevents you from using existing mechanisms for accessing data. You can still use the lotus.domino API or ODA or the XPages data sources. You can use the relational ones. You can use whatever you want. Those will still work. Nothing prevents any of that stuff from working. These XP Domino document things don't exist in the other parts, but the core parts of data access and the Domino API definitely do. So I'll talk now about kind of the REST services based approach. So this is where you're primarily focusing on writing REST services to be consumed by something else. The something else will likely be a JavaScript app written in React or another toolkit. It might also be a remote application. So you could say, I'm going to write REST services here. So for example, like how Keep is a series of REST services, you could do your version of that and say, I just want to expose this. I've already written my business logic, and then I'm going to have some other application. that accesses it. That might be a Java application, it might be a Node.js application, it might be in Python or Ruby or whatever. Most of the time, it's probably going to be something like you have your UI written in React and then you store it in the NSF, but you don't have to. You have a lot of options once it comes to REST services. Like that's one of the reasons why people move to this architecture. It leaves all doors open. So one of the pros is that Jakarta REST is very clean. It provides declarative annotations for writing REST services. You also, thanks to MicroProfile, you get an open API spec for free. So this is a neat little trick that it does, is you'll say, okay, I have a resource that's called employees, and within that I have a get that will return a list of employee objects, and I have a post that will accept a new employee object, and then that will create it, and etc. And you have your CRUD operations. Once you do that, the more declarative and more explicit you are with your classes, so you do kind of like JSON conversions and things like that, you will end up with an open API spec that will say, hey, here is the get all employees thing. You can add your own, human language annotations to it as well, but it will say it will return an array of objects that look like this. They have, first name, last name, department, etc. However it's defined, and you kind of just get this for free because it's based on your existing code. So there are, I always call this code first REST, because there's the other way you could do it is that you could write your spec in the abstract and then write your code to that spec. That makes a lot of sense, especially if you have a larger team with a lot of people working on it. I personally quite like this, where it's look, the code is what it is, and then the spec reflects the code, and that's the route this takes, and you kind of just get it built in. You can go to openapi.json within your NSF, and then you'll have that available. This general mechanism scales very well for larger or split teams with a front end and back end separation. So, for example, with one of my clients, over time we split it. It used to be all XPages stuff, but we've kind of split it into. There's still some XPages, but it's mostly client-side JavaScript stuff. So we have people who, I'm one of the ones who works on the server side primarily, and then we have people who work on the client side, and they can work using VS Code or whatever tools they would like, and work with dummy servers and all that sort of stuff, like the whole development flow that goes with this. That team can work with that and then point at like a CI server that we have, whereas the server side stuff is done independently, and obviously we coordinate because we don't want to break all their stuff, but this makes it much better where with something that's all done in an NSF, you kind of have to have everybody on board with using an NSF. You have to have, even if you're primarily doing UI stuff, you still need to know like what the heck is Domino, what the heck is Notes, how does this stuff work, and why is Designer the way it is. You need to know all this stuff, whereas if you have a larger team, either you currently do or you want one, this is a very good way to have that split between the two. The con is that a split app design like this is much more complicated for us than a full server-side toolkit for especially a smaller team. So like if it's just you, having to have two versions of the app and kind of duplicating business logic may not be worth it. So, unless you really want to do React, or you are definitely aiming to have this kind of independence in the future, this will likely be more complicated for you if you go the route of like, instead of doing XPages, you do this, or instead of doing JSF, you do this. It also introduces some security/data leakage concerns when you design your API. I don't want to give the wrong impression here. When you're using any of the data access methods, including Jakarta No SQL, everything is still as the authenticated user. It's not like any of this stuff will let you access documents you're not allowed to access. It's still Domino. It's still readers and authors fields and ACLs and all that. That is still 100% enforced. But what I want to say is, like, for example, kind of like how in the Notes client, you can technically just run a formula and change a field that's not on the form and break all your documents, and Notes developers just kind of want nobody to remember that they're able to do that. Similarly with REST stuff, if you're not careful, if you just show your entire object as part of representation and you don't have any business logic to define like beam validation or even like, for example, something that's supposed to be a computed field, and is just present, and then if you just say, hey, post this to an endpoint and it overwrites whatever's in there, you have to start being careful about that kind of stuff. You don't want to expose data that you don't necessarily want to expose. This won't necessarily, strictly speaking, it won't happen without you doing it, but it does become possible for you to do this in a way that you don't necessarily want to. So you have to be a little more careful. Again, all Domino rules are enforced. I don't want this to seem like I'm saying that you can access documents you're not supposed to access, but there is more to Domino and app security than just strict access to documents. Things get a little fiddlier, and the more separation you have, the more you have to care about that. Like if you have loosey-goosey code on the back end, it doesn't necessarily matter if the form in an XPage only has first name and last name on it. Who cares how poorly you've structured everything else? It starts to matter a lot more when you're using REST services. So the structure of this kind of application is that there are no XPages, but there are still Java classes. So in here, I have a class called to-do resource that defines the REST endpoints and needs no broker access to, it needs no broker layer to access NoSQL. So what I was talking about earlier with CDI and how XPages doesn't really speak CDI, Jakarta REST absolutely does. Like all of your REST endpoints are CDI controlled, and so you can use @inject and all that sort of thing. In this case, I made page UI files as file resources. These would likely be the build output from React or etc. And you might want to put it in web content for larger projects. This could also be in a wholly separate app. It could be, you could copy it to the Domino HTML directory on your server. You could put it in another NSF. You could host it on another server, like not Domino. A lot of times you might have something where, for example, you have Nginx in front that says if you access /UI, it will load up this directory on the file system, and if you access /API, it will do a reverse proxy to Domino, something like that. All options are open. In this example app, because I want this to be consumable just from Designer, this is just a handful of HTML pages that have some JavaScript on them. There's some CSS, and that's about the extent of it. This is almost definitely not how you would do this in production in a real app. You would probably have a more complicated workflow, whether it's you copying files into web content, or you have a whole chain like the NSF ODP tooling. I added features specifically to do this, where you would have built as part of the larger build, you would build your NPM app and then copy the stuff in as web content resources. A lot of options in this example. It's just some HTML files, but you absolutely can put them in file resources. Again, I like putting things in like the place that makes sense when it makes sense. It doesn't always, but in these examples it did. Now, the development experience of this will depend heavily on how you're writing the UI, or if you as the developer are at all. So if you have a fully split team, the development experience is going to be you looking at Java a lot. All the work is going to happen there with model objects, beans, and REST services. So there's not going to be any XPages markup. I'm sure some of us have written apps kind of like along these lines using XPages, where all of our XPages, we just have something that's like API employees.xsp, and it's all it contains is a REST service that has that defines how to access employees, something like that. This is taking that and just doing it all in Java. So you almost definitely will not hit new XPage at any point unless you're blending things together. Designer will help with the Java syntax and source availability. So this project comes with source update site as well. You install that in Designer and you get full Java doc and source access, which is delightful. But it doesn't have any special knowledge of REST endpoints or CDI beans like something like IntelliJ does. So if you've used IntelliJ, and I wouldn't be surprised if Visual Studio Code also has stuff like this, there are some things in Eclipse like this, although they tend to be a little rickety. You can see in IntelliJ, there's like a services panel. I forget what it's called now, but like it will show you these are all of the JAX-RS resources available in this application, and these are all the beans, and these are the properties available on them, and that's neat. Designer will not help you. Like it, obviously it's still all going to be there in Java code, and will do autocomplete when you're writing Java code. It's sometimes neat to just have an overview of your application. Fortunately, you will always have that OpenAPI specification that you can refer to, and that will give you a nice overview of what your application looks like to the outside. But it is worth noting that like Designer helps with the Java side, and if you're writing JavaScript in Designer, it kind of helps with that. But in general, you're not going to get like super duper IDE help, but you're not going to be lost at sea. And then next, I'm going to talk about, this is I kind of put this one in here just for me. I really like writing applications with MVC and Jakarta pages. This depends a lot on the type of application you're writing. So my blog is written in MVC with JSP. The very slowly developed new OpenNTF website is going to be, it's kind of my go-to until I have a reason not to. In this case, you use the MVC spec, which is a kind of newer era Jakarta spec on top of REST services, and write your UI in Jakarta pages. Technically, there are other toolkits you can use that I may add in later, but in general, it's going to be JSP. This is very well suited to suit certain app types, such as document repositories, discussions, and blogs. So if you're going to do a modern UI of the document library template, you might use this. It works very, very well for like, I just want to have, I just want to have something like here is a pool of entities and I want to create them and read them and delete them, like CRUD apps like that. This is nice in that it builds on the clean foundation of Jakarta REST. If you end up looking at the code, or if there's time and I go through some of this stuff code-wise, you'll see that you use the same annotation. So the way in Jakarta REST you define your paths and the methods that respond to, it's the same stuff, and then you just add a new @controller annotation. This pairs very well with a REST API for non-browser clients. So as you expand out here, you could say, okay, this endpoint responds to a request for HTML. This endpoint at the same path responds to a request for JSON, which nicely covers basically a browser versus an API client. That is a little bit out of fashion. I always liked it. Like, that's kind of an old style way to do things where, things can get a little confusing sometimes. I still like it, but that is a nice way to do it. But even if you just also have REST services, that's like /API/v1, and you coordinate things nicely there, you'll be using a lot of the same tools, a lot of the same annotations. So you'll be very, very comfortable with it as you go along. This is also nice, and this is one of the reasons why I like it so much, is that's kind of a back to basics focus on HTML and HTTP. So I cut my teeth on web programming with PHP. I have since learned better, but there is something nice about just, there's a request coming from a browser and you render a page. That's it. There's no server-side state. You can have beans and stuff, but like the page itself is just the HTML that comes back, in the same way that you might send JSON back to the client. The way that you end up writing this is that you'll write, here's what happens when you do a get, here's what happens when you do a post, here's what happens when you do a delete, etc. There's some fancy stuff to do with that. But the idea is that this focuses much more on like kind of the raw elements. It doesn't try to pretend that HTTP is anything other than what it is. It doesn't have like the page state, the view state that XPages and JSF do. The cons is that if you don't have server-side state, that makes complex forms and workflows difficult. So a lot of, the XPages bread and butter is taking a very complex notes form with tabs and phases and hide whens and computations and all that, and doing that in a slightly newer way. This is not good for that. Like, you can do all of that. You could do that all in JavaScript. You could do it with just re-rendering the same page over and over again. But if you're used to rendered equals being a conditional thing and partial refreshes and all of that, you will have no assistance here. So if you're doing a complex line of business sort of application, which admittedly almost all of us always are, this is not what you want. I still like it. Again, I think that if you're doing a certain type of application, this can suit it extremely well. But admittedly, a lot of like fiddly line of business stuff it's not for. And another aspect is that Designer considers JSP pages as HTML. There's no special JSP editor in Designer. That's something I may try to get in there, but it gets weird as far as like Designer's split from Eclipse and all of that sort of thing. So it's really just HTML, which, fair enough, Designer can edit HTML with a plum, but it doesn't know anything about JSP. So the structure of this, when you're looking at the NSF, it does look similar to the REST version. Here, controller refers to the actual MVC @controller annotation. These are special kinds of REST resources. So in the XPages one, I did controller in kind of the like loosey-goosey, not really kind of way that I've done controller in XPages for decades or whatever now. But here it's actually the actual controller part of MVC. And so these are special classes. Again, I put pages as file resources in here. Larger projects would put them in web content. In my other projects, I've done so, but I like, for these examples, I want to make it so that you don't have to go to Package Explorer, basically. Here, you put them within web-inf and /views for the pages. So view is the V part of MVC. So you're saying the model is your to-do that we've showed before, the JNoSQL thing. Your controller is the to-dos controller that says, when you go to /to-dos, I will handle that. And then part of handling that will be that it will render the view of to-dos with some data in it. So it ends up being definitely what MVC means without a lot of the pretend state stuff for HTTP, even though that pretend state stuff is actually extremely useful a lot of the time. The development experience is okay. Like I said, it knows about HTML well enough, but it won't help with JSP tags. JSP as a language, especially if you avoid some of the stuff from the 90s, is small enough that you'll quickly memorize the basics. So like in XPages, you have XP repeat. In JSP, you have usually C:4 each. Same idea. And you have C if for a conditional rendering and etc. It's small enough usually that you'll get used to it. So that's what I've done, where I just kind of don't have to look up too much. If you do, there's a lot of resources. Like it's a very old framework, and so there's a lot of stuff out there. Some of it is bad advice, but the basics are still there. If you look up like how do I do a conditional in JSP, you'll find that. The Java side is going to be very similar to writing normal REST services. So once you get used to doing REST services or vice versa, this will be very comfortable to you as well. Because again, MVC builds directly on the Jakarta REST framework. So this is a neat way to do that in a way that keeps using CDI and Jakarta REST, etc. Now, finally, I want to talk a little about Jakarta faces. So this one is, the idea is that you'd write Jakarta faces pages and access them similar to XPages. So this is, XPages is like an old version of JSF. This is a new version of JSF. The pro is that this is a very, very similar structure to XPages. So if you're used to that, or if you just like the idea and you like the benefits, this is the same thing. So JSF is the same idea. It's very good for complex forms and other fiddly work. So the more nitty gritty you have to get in your development, the better XPages and Jakarta faces are going to be for you. It has another benefit over XPages, and that is actively developed. There's new stuff. Much like a lot of other Java EE stuff, it went through some doom and gloom times, but the latest version in JE10 and the new one in 11 are adding new features and removing the old features. It's actively developed. It still has interest. There's still the whole like which way the winds are blowing for the industry, like server-side rendering versus client-side rendering, that might be coming back in this direction. So it has less interest than pure client-side development, but it is actively developed, and that's neat. You can use other actively developed third-party libraries like Prime Faces. There's been a lot of neat stuff going on in Discord on that front. So Prime Faces is not the only game in town. There's also Apache Tobago and other things at OmniFaces, I think. But Prime Faces is kind of the go-to when you want to say, I want to add stuff onto JSF. You can think of Prime Faces as kind of like the extension library is for XPages if you also wrap in the newer themes and things like that. So Prime Faces and others are good, are good for visual improvements. They come with nice themes, and you can buy premium themes, etc. And they also just have nicer components. So you can think of them kind of like the extension library on top of JSF. And because JSF has been around and is used by a lot of companies, there are lots of existing examples. Kind of similar to JSP, some of them are a little crusty and old, but they still exist, and that's neat. Some of the cons, like JSP, Designer considers JSF pages as just HTML, so it doesn't help with JSF tags. That can get a little more difficult to JSP because JSF tags are going to be more complicated. So much like you'll have, it's one thing to have a for each where it's just loop over this thing. It's another thing to say, I have a carousel and here's how many seconds it should be in between, and here's the animation style. Like, you're gonna have to do a lot of references externally. And additionally, third-party libraries like prime faces can require some manual fiddling to avoid conflicts with the XPages runtime. This is an area of active development and active research, we'll say. I want to make this better. There are some hard limits. Part of the problem is that third-party libraries will generally put things in their faces config files, and then the XPages runtime, even if you're not using XPages, will see that and then throw up. And so you have to be very, very careful when you're working with these to not do anything that will step on the XPages runtime. It's, they are not separate, even though, they are close cousins, and that can cause some serious trouble. The structure of this is the same general idea as the XPages version. Here, controller, again, is more like the XPages one. It's not an official concept. Much like with XPages, Faces has an implicit controller that you don't write. It's technically called controller, but it's often the case that people will either write something like the controller classes that are manually instantiated as in my framework, or they will use a series of managed beans, which is also a common idiom in XPages. I'm still not in love with that structure, but it is what it is. You'll probably end up having something like this. Here, this in the example app, the controller is a managed bean, because I just said, all right, I only, there's just the to-dos, that's all I need to care about. And as a bit of a note, Faces files generally use .xhtml, which is fairly generic, but it kind of staked its claim there. But you can also use .jsf. I kind of like using .xhtml because I still like XHTML, even though it's very much on the outside. I'm a holdout there. But you can also call them .jsf to make things a little clearer for, say, another developer who comes in and sees that. Will at least give a hint as to why you have all these weird XHTML files there. And now, I think since I am actually good on time, I was going to talk a little bit about project information and contributing, but instead what I'm going to do is try to see if I can clean up my Windows VM enough so I can show off the code a little bit. I don't know how well this is going to work. I kind of got out of the business of doing live demos just because they're usually disastrous, and I am tempting fate by doing so today. But let's see how this goes. All right, so go over here. I have a workspace, and these are the 4 example applications. I hadn't set this up to be presentable, but I'll go through these a little bit just because it will be useful to actually see the code. Let's see, does this?
Yes.
Good.
What yes. Version is this? What version are you running?
This is, I think it's 1202. So these generally work. Oh, that's actually a good point with 14. I generally use 1202. The project in general should work in 901, FP10 and above. I haven't used those in a long time. The project also generally works in 14. There are some limitations when it comes to JSP and in the latest build with Jakarta persistence. But in general, I'm trying to make this so that it especially works in 1202, should work in 1201 and 12. And as much as possible, and I'm trying to nudge things in that direction, should work in 14 as well. So you could use Designer 14 as long as your server is 14, or you change the project compilation. And most of this stuff should generally work fine. I'm trying to keep things as smooth as possible without too many hiccups. So good question. So I talked a couple times about the model object. I showed some of the code. So this is that object. Because it's Java, you have a lot of this stuff at the end where it's, you have your getters and setters. But the idea is what I said here, where you have @entity, which defines this is a model object, and then the form name is to-do. If you leave that off, it will assume that the class name is the form name. So if you have a class name person and you have just @entity without anything, it will assume it's person as the form name, so that it maps to that. You have this ID annotation that maps to the UNID of the document. You don't have to have that in there. It will still obviously, all documents will get UNIDs, but this will add that there. And then you have these @columns, and that defines the properties on the object that are loaded from and stored to the documents in the back end. You can see one thing I added here, @notEmpty. That is from the bean validation specification. There are a lot more constraints like that, but not empty is a big one. Basically, that means required. So with this class, if you're using Jakarta No SQL, you cannot save a document unless the title is set to something that's not null and not an empty string. You can do things like at min for numbers, and at size you can say it has to be 3 characters to 20 characters or whatever. Like if you're an American bank and you want to have a bad password, you can do that sort of thing. And it has a lot of things. You can have custom annotations, sorts of things. I don't really go into that here. That's kind of one of the many things that you probably will want to do, but doesn't really show up here. And so, I won't really go into the XPages because, it's XPages. This is what XPages looks like. You're probably familiar with this already. A lot of that stuff's the same. I do think it will be useful to show a little bit about REST and JSF. So I talked a lot in broad terms about REST services and how they're defined with annotations and how that works. So here I want to show some of that off. So here you have this to-dos resource class, and it has this @path annotation, and it says to-dos. So when you do this, everything within this will be available within your NSF at xsp/app/whatever you have here. The xsp/app is there to kind of like tell Domino, hey, I want to put this in fancy code. So it's a little longer of a URL than I would like, but that's the way to get there with Domino. And so what you're doing here, you are writing your REST services directly in Java. So you can say when you're doing @get at the base URL, it will produce JSON, and this is specifically saying it's going to do a list of to-do objects, and then it will take query parameters. You can do things like if you're doing a post, you can do form parameters, you can do header parameters, you can do, I think, cookie parameters as well, although a lot of the times you don't necessarily want to do that. But what you're doing here is you're defining the thing. And so here, this query parameter is not required. So I'm saying if the status is null, so if you're just saying, give me all to-dos, find all, sorted by created ascending, and the NoSQL driver knows how to deal with all this, and then collect them into a list. So what you'll get out of this is a Java or a JSON array of to-do objects, all of the ones that are in the database. So it'll just be a nice clean JSON thing. So you'll note I don't have any code in here that actually converts this to JSON. I don't have to say anything that says, okay, write out an opening square bracket, write out an opening curly bracket. This is all happening implicitly with the framework. So I say list of to-do, and then what will happen is that the framework will see that and say, okay, well, I know that a list looks like an array, so I will start writing that as an array, and for each object, I will convert that to JSON. So that will happen if it's a map, then it will just convert to a JSON object, and if it's a custom object like to-do, it will go through and by default just say, I see there's document ID, so emit that as a property document ID. I see there's this, and emit that as that. You can custom tailor this stuff. I didn't really hear, but this will just kind of happen for you. You just return the object. And the nice thing here is that because I'm saying return the object, then if you look at the OpenAPI spec, which I don't really want to bring up here because they would be best with Swagger and I'll have that set up, but you would see that this returns array of a model called to-do, and it would tell you it has a document ID property, it's a string, it has a title property, it's a string, and that title property is required, and it actually learns all of this stuff and gleans it from your code. And the other part of this is that if you do pass in a status, either complete or incomplete, it uses that find by status. And again, that's kind of happening. Well, I hate the term magically for this, but it is, well, you can consider it magic. It just happens that it knows that that means status equals complete or status equals incomplete. And then it does a sort created. The sorting triggers the query results processor capabilities. And so that handles that, and it tries to do that as efficiently as possible, and it does some checks internally to say, oh, if the data doesn't change, it can reuse the same view, and etc. So that's just kind of that's your basic, like, give me a list of these. So when you have the actual application, let's see, hopefully there's nothing horrifying in Firefox here. Good. Oh, it's just the OpenNTF page. Let's see. Frickin'. Just a second. So if you go to to-dos, it calls this. If you look, inspect at the network, you can see that returns a response of, it's just JSON. So it's what you might expect. It converted all these objects into their nice JSON representations, and that's all happening from this. You also have other further resources that do things like path for document ID. And so what this would be is if you do /todos/a UNID, it will give you just that one. So if I go here, see example one, I can see I did a request to, well, it's very, very tiny, but XSP app to-dos, and then the response is that object. This is probably all very, very tiny in the share, but trust me, it's a JSON object, and it's just returning that individual one. So what you're doing here is you're writing out your API nicely. Everything's clean, and so you can write, you can do whatever, however you want to lay things out. You can do that. So, for example, and then here I have the one that says I want to create a new one. I'm saying create a new one. I do this at valid annotation. So it means that when you're posting JSON to this endpoint, it should be a to-do and it should be valid. That triggers that same rule. So if you post a to-do that has a blank title, it will fail. I forget what the response is, but it'll be a nice HTTP status code for like, that's an illegal operation. Basically, you can't send that. So here it does that validation for you. You can do that similarly. You can have, like, for example, if this query parameter had to be not empty, I would do not empty. With path parameters, you don't have to do that because it wouldn't match if it's empty. But you can apply the same kind of validation rules. And that's the sort of thing I was talking about with things like EL and CDI, where all of these specs are meant to work together. Like they, you use the same concepts in many, many places. So here I want to make sure that if you're passing in a to-do, I don't want it to, you can't make a new one with its own document ID. So clear that out. They always have to start at incomplete. And this is where you could do some post-creation or pre-creation business rules and things like that. And then here I defined a special operation. So I just want to say, all I want to do is toggle between incomplete and complete. So here I'm posting to this endpoint will allow you to find this document ID and then toggle its thing. So this is where you'd have, rather than doing like a full REST style representational state transfer, you just have it's essentially an action endpoint where you might say like, look, just do this thing. So this could be if you have approval or something like that, then there are ways to structure those in RESTier ways than this. But like that may be something where you come in and say, approve this document. So that way you don't have to have your logic on the client side saying, pull down the document, change your approvers, and et cetera. You can just post it to the server and say, do your approval, and then that will run your business logic. So if you had existing business logic, that would work here, and so forth. So you can do fancy things like patch and delete. So as long as you've enabled these things on your website document for the server, you can modify these things. You can use these extended kind of attributes, since patch is the idiomatically correct way to do a partial modification of an item. So it says, okay, well here I only support changing the status and the title, so that's how I do the patch. And then at delete is, well, it deletes. So that's a nice thing. If you're using a full-on REST client, then you can do that. So this is, if you're doing REST services, you'll be looking at these annotations a lot. You can do more than just JSON. So as the MVC application does, it accepts form URL encoded because that's very friendly for browsers. You could also do XML, you could do plain text, you could do CSV, like whatever. We have these kind of this media type class, but these are just strings that represent the MIME types. You can do whatever you want. So you could have a REST resources, as I've done in projects, that returns the Office XML format for spreadsheets, for example. And that's not necessarily RESTy, but it is true. So you can have that and define all that, and you're not restricted to that. There are more advanced things that you can do, streaming output. So if you've ever used, and actually a lot of this REST stuff gets back to if you've ever used Wink, which is used in the extension library. This is the much newer version of that. You can do streaming output and all that kind of stuff, and it all works nicely. You can do what's called server sent events, which is sort of which is a not exactly push technology. It's not quite WebSockets, but it actually solves a lot of the problems of WebSockets. I think I have an example of that in the project repository. So there's a lot, admittedly, there's a lot here. All of this stuff, and the reason I didn't want to just go through code bit by code bit and instead have more of the overview of what this is that I think it'll be more useful to look at the code yourself. So all of this stuff is in the project itself. So that's at GitHub. It's also at OpenNTF. I release these things fairly frequently. So if you just go to OpenNTF, you'll probably see a recent release that has, that'll link back to the GitHub project as well. At the GitHub project in the examples directory, there's the to-dos, and that has all of this code. So I encourage you to take a look at that. A while back, Graham and I did a YouTube series talking about this. The project has evolved since then, but a lot of the ideas are still the same. So I think that series still holds up. If you want to have a more component by component overview of what goes on in this project, I encourage you to check that out. Again, back a little bit to the requirements and compatibility. Most of this stuff should be fine with Domino 901 FP10. Certain parts require 1201 and above with fixed packs for NoSQL. So a lot of the NoSQL stuff, uses DQL, so you have to have DQL. But then the QRP stuff requires QRP with views. I think in 12.0, when they added QRPs with views, they were broken in Linux, so you need 1201 for that. In general, 1202, it should be your go-to. Like I mentioned, it should also work in Domino 14. Currently, JSP does not work properly in Domino 14 unless you mess with your JVM because it doesn't ship with a compiler. That's something I hope will improve. If it doesn't, I'll work something out. This in general should work with most or all existing libraries. I'm using it in production alongside ODA and POI for XPages. There's always a chance that some library will conflict. If you do try it out and your stuff doesn't load anymore, like if you install this and suddenly your old stuff doesn't work, let me know in Discord. Put it in there. Maybe somebody else has run into this, or maybe there's for example, at one point I think there was a conflict with Verse because we were using two different versions of the same library, or same library by two names or something like that. Maybe it was a Leap, one of those products I don't use. So the more you can try it out, and if you do run into trouble, let me know. And this can also be used with OSGI bundles with some knowledge. Again, I do use this stuff extensively with OSGI-based servlets and web apps, but it is a lot more difficult to do that than it is to use it in Designer.
Quick comment, Jesse,
yep.
With respect to versions, when you talk about it works in this version or that version, what you're intending to say is that both the client and the server should be at the same version level, yeah? Ideally.
I mean, you can mix and match a little bit. So for example, if you are using 12.00 on the client and 12.02 on the server, you'd be in the clear. If you're using 14 on the client, as long as you configure it to compile down to Java 8 and you're using 12.02 on the server, you should be in the clear. But like most things with Domino, ideally you want to match these things. They both need to be above the minimum. It is less, newer versions are more important on the server because that's where the stuff is actually executing. So for example, the parts about QRP and DQL don't necessarily, they shouldn't matter on the client. I would still recommend, just in general, I would say use 12.02 because, even though people have run into qualms with Designer, I found it overall better than the other ones. The newer the better, and ideally match it. You don't have to strictly match it, but that's always a good idea.
Yeah.
So if anyone wants to get involved, you can try it out and talk about it in the OpenNTF Discord. There is a specific projects channel that's it's kind of a forum type channel in there, and there's a section for the Jakarta EE project in there. So we welcome all discussion. There's usually something going on in there. Feel free to report bugs and request features. The best place for that is either in Discord, or if it's definitely a bug or a feature request, it can go well on the GitHub project. That's the main way I manage the project. I use the issues list there. If you are up for helping with documentation, Lord knows it could use more. So if you want to write a guide, like record a video and expand on specific feature details, we could start up a wiki on GitHub or something like that. Or if you just write blog posts about using it, talk about your experiences with it, all the better. If you have example applications you write, this is a general issue that I have for like just tracking, hey, I want more example applications. So the to-do apps in here are some of those. And you can also chip in on the code directly. While it has been primarily my project, it's not exclusively my project, and it is, it's an open source thing. So if you have code improvements that you want to make, feel free to fork and do pull requests. Those are definitely welcome. So I'll say thank you and open this up for questions. So as a reminder for questions, you can use the GoToWebinar questions pane. I see we're not heavy on questions right now, but sometimes those come in at the end. So feel free to ask about any of this stuff, just general questions or requests for whatever with the project actually. So you can use that question pane. We'll go through the all of one question that we have at the moment. Actually, I guess I'll just read it. So where are all the Jakarta jar files? That's a good question. So usually, if you have a Jakarta EE project, the specs and implementations have to come from somewhere. Like you don't just necessarily get Jakarta REST for free or all these others. So for example, if you're used to developing applications with Tomcat, Tomcat will provide you with the servlet implementation and JSP, but that's it. You don't get REST, you don't get CDI, you don't get JSF, you don't get any of that stuff. And the way that you end up working with it is either you would manually add the jar files to your project, or you would use something like Maven and say, I want to include all these. If you use something more like Glassfish or Open Liberty or Payara or one of the other JEE or Tommy, one of the full like Jakarta EE servers, that's actually kind of more like the experience that you get with Domino here, which is that the server provides it for you. The implementation of that varies wildly from server to server. The way I'm doing it here is that these are all available packaged as OSGI bundles. So you install that into your server, usually at an NSF-based update site, and you install them into Designer, and they are available there. So it's all done, all that stuff. I do the heavy lifting of tying all that stuff together in OSGI and protecting it from the ancient stuff in Designer, and getting all that stuff working. So all of the actual implementation, so for example, the JSF implementation is MyFaces, and the CDI implementation is Weld, and the JAX-RS implementation is REST Easy. All that stuff you don't need to care about. In a more bare bones Tomcat style application, you would care. You would be pulling these things in specifically. That's all provided for you. If you want to bring in additional libraries, you can put them in the code jars resources. So for example, if you're doing prime faces, there's a special case for prime faces, but if you're doing other things, you can add them there and use those libraries. But in general, you don't need to put anything in your NSF for implementation other than installing this stuff in Designer and on the server and then checking them. Then they're kind of like implicitly provided by the installed environment. So you don't need to drag a bunch of jar files into the NSF, which is good because Designer's performance would fall through the floor if you did that. So that's the long answer. The short answer is you don't need to know where they are. It's just they're done via OSGI and that's it.
But does the documentation include how to do the update site installation?
I think I linked to what is hopefully still the current place on HCL's site. I mean, if you, it's the same as something like ODA or POI for XPages or how the extension library used to be. I think hopefully I linked to that. I mean, that documentation has moved around a couple places from several times at IBM and then over to HCL. Yeah. It's the same idea as those. If I don't have that in there, that would be good to add. But it's meant to be, well, it is just the same as other XPages libraries of that type.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to really add there is for people who are familiar with Domino, it's not anything different than a whole lot of the different tools that are available from OpenNTF and other places to do an update site installation. If you are unfamiliar with that, look up update site, and again, as Jesse says, there's a link in the documentation, but it's really not a complicated process.
I would imagine there's probably a notes in 9 about that. From
there absolutely is, in fact, yes.
And that would still apply, all the same rules. So all this stuff, if you find anything from the 852 and 853 era about installing the extension library and how to get that installed in Designer and on Domino, all of that applies. It's the same idea. And that, I mean, and that's one of the overarching things, like how I've said, you don't need to know Maven, you don't need to use Eclipse or IntelliJ or VS Code. Like you can for some of this stuff, but the idea is that this should be, it's bigger than a lot of other, it's bigger than a lot of other previous XPages extensions, but it's still meant to be an XPages extension, even when you're not using XPages. Like it's meant to build on the things that are provided by the framework. So in implementation it is sprawling, but in usage it's meant to be install it, enable the libraries, and then you're good to go.
All right. One other question. Can we integrate with AngularJS or React?
Yes. So that is that goes into the REST style mode of application development I talked about. I didn't show those mostly because if I was going to, like, I didn't want to balloon the example out by having also like a package.json and an npm build and all the stuff that kind of goes along with AngularJS and React. Like that would be very outside of the example I wanted to show. But that is absolutely possible. And again, like I do that with one of my client projects. So we have somebody who does, it's in Angular, and those are built during a Maven build, and then they're brought into an NSF or an OSGI plugin, depending on what it is, and they use these REST services. So there's a couple ways you could do that. Like you could have it so that you build your JS application and then copy all of those files into the NSF, like in the web content folder, and serve them from there. You could put them in a different NSF. You could put them on the file system. You could put them on a different server. Because at that point, the REST services are just REST services. So the same way that you would access REST services defined in Node.js or Python or whatever. I mean, it's not as tightly as if you have a like full-on like front end and back end are both JavaScript and they do weird stuff like I know Meteor at least used to do back in the day. But you can absolutely use these, and that is a fairly common way of doing it. It's not in this example just because having the tool chain of Node.js would be overkill for this purpose, and honestly most purposes, but you absolutely can, and you would probably be heavily writing REST services with the Jakarta REST annotations. So that's all the stuff about at path and at get and at delete and all that. So absolutely, yes, that would be a very common one, and you could do that yourself or with a larger team. That's probably the most scalable of the routes for app dev.
All right, and I just had a thought as I was watching you go along there. It really feels like, at least for somebody who has been developing XPages for some time, there's a great opportunity to unlearn or move past some of the more onerous development constructs and kind of speed up your development. But it's a matter of getting familiar with the new terms.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because that's definitely the case where there's like a lot of stuff that you may think you have to do, but you don't. So I think a fairly straightforward example of that would be JSON generation. So, if you're not used to this kind of implicit conversion to JSON, you might have either used the IBM Commons stuff or Jackson or JSON or something like that, either to write out JSON in kind of a streaming way where you would say start objects, write property, end object, or you would do a JSON manual conversion. But here you don't. You can, like that's what JSONP is for, but there's a lot of stuff that's like implicit where you just say this REST service consumes JSON and you can convert that to an object and it will emit JSON. You just send it objects. And that's like work you just don't have to do. It's not necessary, like there's nothing immediately telling you don't have to do that unless you listen to me tell you don't have to, but that's the sort of thing where it's like once you get used to that, you're like, oh, I could just not write that code. There's a lot of stuff you just don't have to write, and that is a huge difference.
Excellent. All right. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Jesse, for presenting. We'll wrap it up here and look forward to seeing you at CollabSphere. And then a reminder to everyone about the repair cafes, the APAC Repair Cafe this evening, at least North America time, tomorrow morning or during the day in the APAC time zones. And the Repair Cafe that we're going to do live at CollabSphere next week. We will host that on Discord as well as doing it live at CollabSphere, so people can participate online using the normal way that we do it on Discord for other repair cafes. And then we'll be back around next month with another webinar. Thanks everyone for attending and have a great day.